Hope you guys can see that. It is an autographed jersey, sweatshirt, by Evander Holyfield, who was the heavyweight champion of the world back 20-some years ago, I guess. If anybody ever heard of Evander Holyfield, one of the best boxers in recent memory. This guy right here is me. And the guy in the middle, in the white, is a guy named Abraham Okun, who was a tremendous boxer. Finally got a chance to fight for a world championship on ESPN, got knocked out in the first round. So up until then, he was a tremendous boxer. And here is an article that I wrote back when I was a sports writer. I show you all this to let you know what a big boxing fan I am. Now, why is that important that I'm a big boxing fan? Because this week, we're going to be talking about boxing, rock and roll, poetry, and civil rights. All those things are going to come together in the story of Rubin Hurricane Carter. So you guys are going to watch a video that's going to give you a little bit more detail about him. We're going to look at a timeline of some things that happened to him in the 1960s and 70s. But first, I'm going to tell you a little story about Hurricane Carter and who he is and why we're talking about him now. So Hurricane Carter, a guy by the name of Rubin Carter, was a middleweight boxer from New Jersey. They called him Hurricane because his fists were so fast and could do so much damage. Great nickname for a fighter, right? So he's this fighter. He's trying to win a championship. He was a top contender for the middleweight crown. He was about to get a chance to fight for the middleweight championship of the world. Well, let's rewind a little bit. Back in 1966, in the summer, a couple of white men walked into a black bar. Argument broke out, shots were fired, and a white man killed a black man in the bar. About 6 hours later, two black men walked into a nearby white bar and opened fire. It was not a robbery. They just opened fire in the bar. Some people thought it might be revenge for the earlier shooting. No one really knew for sure, but two men died right away. A grandmother was also fatally wounded, and one guy got shot in the head but lived for a while. He was the only survivor. About 10 minutes later, about 1 mile away, Rubin Carter, Hurricane Carter, right, the fighter, him and his buddy John Artis were pulled over by police. They were questioned, but they were let go. A long time went by, and they still hadn't found the shooter. Eventually, Hurricane Carter and his buddy John Artis were arrested, charged with murder, convicted of triple murder without a whole lot of evidence, and they were sentenced to life in prison. This was in 1967. So 8 years later, in 1975, Hurricane Carter had written an autobiography telling about his story, telling about his innocence. And a guy by the name of Bob Dylan, some of you guys may have heard of him. He was an American rock singer. Bob Dylan was in France on tour. He read Hurricane Carter's autobiography, came back to the United States, and decided he was going to go visit him in jail. So he visits him in prison in New Jersey, and Carter immediately bonds with Dylan. Carter said, "We talked for many, many hours, and I recognized that this man was like my brother." Dylan felt the same way. He said, "I realized after we talked for a while that he and I both had the same philosophy." So Hurricane Carter wrote a book claiming he was innocent, telling the story. Bob Dylan, after visiting Carter in jail, sat down and wrote an epic 10-minute song telling the story of Hurricane Carter. The book and the song by Dylan brought a little bit more attention to the case. And a year later, in 1976, New Jersey overturned the convictions and ordered a new trial. So Carter and Artis were released from jail. That winter, they had their new trial. They were both found guilty again, sent back to prison. Finally, in 1985, after almost 20 years in prison, the state of New Jersey recognized that the trials were based not on reality, but instead on racism, and these guys were freed. About 15 years after that, in the 2000s, Denzel Washington starred in a movie about the case. He played Hurricane Carter. About 5 years ago or so, Rubin Hurricane Carter died of cancer. He was 76, 77 years old. So he's been dead for a while now. But I want to talk about this song, and I want to talk about this case, and that's what we're going to do all week. So look at the slides today. You're going to listen to the song tomorrow, and we're going to treat it just like poetry.